they want. Whether you work for someone else, you're an entrepreneur, thinking about starting your own business, or at a point in your life where you just can't make the move from where you are to where you want to go, you're in the right place. This podcast is all about answering one question: what's your next move? And helping you harness your power so your next move is the one that changes your life. I'm your host and resident provocateur, Arlene Battisil, and I want to know, what's your next move? Hey everybody, it's Arlene Battisil, your host and resident provocateur, and I have a very wonderful and special guest with me today, my friend Jeffrey Shaw. And we're going to have a very exciting and lively conversation today. But let me tell you just a little bit about Jeffrey. And I'm just going to give you his bio from his incredible book called Lingo. And it says, having a keen eye isn't just for what one sees, but also for what one senses. Having been one of the most sought-after portrait photographers in the U.S. for more than 3 decades, Jeffrey Shaw, also known as the Lingo Guy, used this honed intuition to attract and maintain specific markets by speaking their secret language. Jeffrey is the host of the popular business podcast Creative Warriors, a nationally acclaimed keynote speaker, a business coach for entrepreneurs, and the author of Lingo, Discover Your Ideal Customer's Secret Language and Make Your Business Irresistible. So Jeffrey, thank you so much for being with me today. After all of our technical difficulties, we are finally talking to each other. So welcome.
Well, it's my pleasure. And you know, it is all about your next move, right? When technology fails, like, where do I go now? What's the next move? So
yeah, let's see how many
you live your truth.
Platforms. Yes, I do, baby. Yes, I know. Well, we're going to have a really wonderful conversation today because I think it's just so fascinating that you went from this extraordinary career and still have as a photographer, and then move into the world of coaching entrepreneurs. And why don't you tell me a little bit about the photography work that you've done, and then also walk me through how you ended up writing this book and the coaching career that you've had.
Mm-hmm. You know, Arlene, what I think is so fascinating about your show, just the theme of it, because I was thinking about this before our conversation today, the question, you know, what's your next move? Mm-hmm. There's a lot, you know, the word pivot is like a buzzword in business today, and it's awesome. But when I think of pivoting, I think of it as a more sudden move, you know, as one does.
Mm-hmm.
And when one pivots, it's a more sudden move. But I love the idea of like, what's your next move? Like, I just think of, I don't know, when I think of what's your next move, I think of it in longer term. And boy, I can tell you over the course of my 33 years as an entrepreneur, there have been a lot of moves, right? Which it's a conscious choice as opposed to a quick reaction. I see pivots as being a little more reactionary, but I love this whole idea. So
no, that's really magnificent. And it's such an interesting thing that you point out in the difference between the two, because you're absolutely right. So many people always talk about, oh, you have to pivot, but usually a pivot is in reaction and you're still in reaction mode. Whereas when you go to a place of what's your next move, you really are being very deliberate about it, which keeps you in a place of staying focused on what do I need to do here, instead of getting all wrapped up in, oh my God, I'm reacting to this thing that's happening. So that's such a great observation that I appreciate so much.
Yeah, because for me, my life has been a series of moves more than pivots, right? I see, you know, my whole career direction from setting out as a photographer at the age of 20 to failing for the first 3 years and needing to reinvent my intentions as a photographer. So by the age of 23, I was reinventing who I thought I needed to be as a photographer. And that led me into just an amazing career, tremendous success, even still in my 20s, and, you know, really fulfilling career as a portrait photographer. So basically, you know, what I do as a portrait photographer is I photograph families and children on location for very affluent families. So, you know, it's been just a magnificent career. It's brought me all over the world because the families I work with have multiple homes. And, you know, but yet there was a yearning inside of me about 9-10 years ago to pursue personal development, although I didn't know exactly what that move would look like. But I just knew that, you know, I'd always, I joke that I was like, I was a closeted, and you and I know a lot about closets, but I was a closeted I was a closeted personal development junkie as a teenager. Like I would literally, I was reading Wayne Dwyer and books like that, but I would hide them when somebody walked in the room because that was just weird when I was, a kid. Certainly in my upbringing, my family. So I would hide the fact that I was interested in personal development. So about 10 years ago, I just had this yearning that I just couldn't deny, that I wanted to understand what made us freaking tick, what made us humans think and act. So I started pursuing coach trainings. That was kind of my next move. And, I feel, quite honestly, Arlene, right now, I feel like I'm in possibly one of the biggest moves of my career, just
Really?
where I'm at right now. So, which we could dive in if you want more specifics, but I like this idea of, it's moving. Right. I love this. I really embrace the idea of what you're presenting. Like, where are you moving? It's got, if you could see me, I've literally got my hands like the shape of a globe and how the earth rotates, right? Where are you moving?
Well, what's so interesting is when I think about what's your next move, it's all about momentum, because as is often the case for anyone who runs into some kind of a roadblock in their life, it stops their momentum. And I don't know about you, but for me, if I can't keep moving, it's like sharks. If they don't keep moving, they die. And I don't consider myself a shark out in the world by any stretch of the imagination, but this idea of continuing to move, to be able to keep going forward, to be able to keep searching, to be pursuing things, and the momentum that comes with it. There's certain energy that's generated by that momentum. And when you get stuck, that momentum goes away and you're fucked. And have you found, do you feel that same way about yourself, this need to keep moving?
Yeah, well, yes, most definitely. I'm always, as a lot of creative thinkers are, right? We're always sit still. Well, I'm always in movement. My life. Yeah, my life is always in movement. And by example, I think this is kind of a cool comparison, sort of the literal definition of moving, but then how it affects how you move in your life. So let's see, 2.5 years ago. Yeah, about 2.5 years ago, I'm from Manhattan originally, but 2.5 years ago, I went to Miami Beach. It was an intended 3-month escape from New York City winters. So I had rented 2 different Airbnbs in the Miami area, one in Coral Gables and one in North Beach, Miami. And the goal was 6 weeks in each Airbnb. I was going to be here for a total of 3 months. Well, to make a long story short, I never left. So at the end of the 3 months, I really fell in love with the sun. I fell in love with the fact that everybody's happy. I fell in love with the fact that you wake up in the morning and the sun is shining and we literally have wild parrots, bright green wild parrots flying around. And there's just so much to fall in love with. I decided not to go back. And it was, talk about a quick move. I mean, it was so quick. I just said, I had worked really hard up to this point in my life to basically create a location-independent lifestyle, although I wasn't really. I mean, my photography business was still pretty contingent on a clientele in the Northeast, which is where I had built my clientele. But hey, it's only a flight away. I'm very fairly financially compensated for what I do as a photographer. So it's just a flight. And I often wind up traveling to meet them at other locations anyway. So I didn't see it as entirely prohibitive to my career. So on a whim, I decided I would stay here and decided on a Saturday. By Tuesday, I had signed a 2-year lease on my dream apartment. And upon signing the lease, drove over to a Mini Cooper dealer because I came down to Florida with my Lexus SUV and I handed my keys into and said, "You can have this one. I'll leave with this one." And I left with this hot little cute white Mini Cooper. And then called my kids and said, "Oh, I have 3 kids in the Northeast. And, oh, by the way, I'm not coming home. I'm going to stay here." Now,
wait, did they think you were running away?
I can't say they were. No, my kids are pretty used to their dad. Not that I've never made a sudden physical move like that, but I don't think anything really shocks them at this point. And they. And again, kind of felt the same way. My daughters were a little apprehensive. They're like, well, right away. I mean, they're only like 20 years old and 24 years old, but right away, what about when we have grandkids? And I'm like, oh my gosh, let's not look so far ahead. But what was interesting is that was, that was kind of a sudden physical move. And that's what I think is interesting, right? So what we're talking about now is a physical move. But what that wound up doing is causing for me to decide to make a lot of other moves in my career, in that I really decided after doing that I didn't want to do so much photography, right? I put ever so slightly an obstacle in the way, which was just needing to get on a plane, and decided, I just don't want to do as much photography as I used to. So I scaled way back. I mean, I went from in my peak years, I used to do about 150 shoots. The year before I moved to Miami, I did 100 shoots, and I pulled it back to 20 shoots.
Wow.
And then now this year I'll do maybe 10, right? So I just really pull it, feeling like, honestly, I've done not that all I can do, but all I really want to do as a photographer. And have just decided to, pull that $1 million business down to, very little in comparison. And strip away, which is what I've been doing over the last few months, just stripping away all that isn't absolutely necessary and not even necessary. I've stripped it down to what I want to do in life. Right? And just said, this is what I want to do. This is the type of coaching I want to do. This is how I want to show up in the world. And it's left me in this really interesting space right now where I am asking, what's your next move? Right? Because it sort of, to me, almost feels like being in an empty room, because I've stripped so much away. It's almost like looking at what your next move is when you're in an empty room. Because it's one thing to question what your next move is when you're standing at a fork in the road.
Yeah.
Right? There's a choice. But when you imagine standing in the middle of a ballroom with no boundaries, no barriers, no directive paths, and asking yourself, what's my next move? If there's a tremendous amount of freedom in it,
right?
Because you can go in any direction, but there's also an unknown.
And that's what I was just going to ask you about, because an empty room can represent something really thrilling or something very scary, or you can experience both feelings at the same time. And is that what you have been feeling, that you're in one or the other or both of those places right now?
When I've got my brain in check, when I've got my feelings in check, it feels like both. And, because I work as a coach, and because I work entirely with entrepreneurs, something I point out often is, as entrepreneurs, we are experiencing the best of times and the worst of times at the same time, all the time. Yep. Right? Yep. It's just the reality of being an entrepreneur. I mean, one minute we're brilliant and the next minute we feel like the biggest losers. So we are literally always experiencing extremes at the same time, all the time. So when I'm in check, it feels both exhilarating, this emptiness of the room. It feels exhilarating and scary.
And why do you think do you think it is in the nature of being an entrepreneur that we feel both of those things, where it's like what you just said, where it is the exhilaration and it is the fear, and your brain is online and your brain is offline, and there's this conflict that goes back and forth in the battle, where it's the best of times and it's the worst of times. Is it just the fact that this is the nature of being an entrepreneur? And if so, why do you think that is?
I think it's, yes, it could certainly be part of the behavioral nature, but I actually think more than anything what it is, it's exposure, right? I think that by being an entrepreneur, we are just innately exposed to more things, right? More things are going on in the course of our day, more interactions. I really just think it's exposure. The more you expose yourself to things, the more you're going to see fluctuation. It's been interesting to me in my book, Lingo, there's, I don't know, it's my own quote. It comes from my own book. Let's see if I can even get it right. But
let me quote myself.
Yeah. Let me see if I can remember what I said. It must have been brilliant. But it's interesting to see, you put a book out there and there's some, 55,000 words in the book. And it's really fascinating to me to see what people pull out. And by far, I said something in this book, something along the lines of entrepreneurship is really about figuring out who you're meant to be, something like that. And it's been interesting that has been by far. I'm actually trying to hop over to my Instagram real quick, because I created a meme from it and put it on Instagram because of the number of people that were constantly retweeting this post. And that to me is what I think we become entrepreneurs because I think it's our best tool for personal development. I think it pushes us to grow. It exposes us to more things than any other. Here it is. Entrepreneurship is about becoming the person we were truly meant to be. And I think, that's what draws us into entrepreneurship. I think, we think we're becoming entrepreneurs because we're setting goals, because we want to succeed in business. I also think it is a deep desire for personal development and exploration. And because of that, we expose ourselves to so many things that in the course of a day, we can experience the best of times and the worst of times. And I just think it's an ongoing process. And, if you want to look at it more universally, there's probably a sense that the universe is pushing us along at a more rapid pace for the lessons that we need to see to be in front of us.
Right. And let me ask you, let's explore this a little bit more. Let's talk about the element of risk and uncertainty. When people are working for someone else in someone else's business, whether it's a corporation or you're working for someone who owns a small business, there isn't a lot of risk there, and there is a tremendous amount of certainty. But when you become an entrepreneur, you accept you've got all the skin in the game, you have all of the risk, and there is no certainty about anything that you're doing. Do you think those are the conditions that lead to our discovering who we're really meant to be? Or do you think that's just a byproduct of being an entrepreneur? That's just the world that we live in, but that it is innate in those of us who are entrepreneurs that we must undertake this journey to discover who we really are meant to be. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, I think, it's funny, and I don't consider myself a risky person in that I'm not drawn, unlike you, like I'm not drawn to riding a motorcycle, and I'm not drawn to speed. I'm not drawn to things that put my life at risk. People are, real adrenaline junkies, and I'm not overly drawn to that. And yet I suppose, but I'll take on an entrepreneurial risk, any day. Right. So I actually did a blog post years ago called We All Have Our Mount Everests, because when I was turning 50 4 years ago, a friend of mine was turning, my closest male friend, he was turning 50 just months before me. And in honor of his 50th birthday, during that course of the year, he was going to climb Mount Everest. And
wow.
I was so humiliated by his, I was like, gosh, I mean, I wouldn't even, there's not a chance that I would step up and climb Mount Everest, right? I was so envious and proud of him, but at the same time, sort of feeling really small. While at the same time, I had signed up for a year-long, really intensive leadership program. And I wrote this article out of appreciation for what he was doing. And I had said to him that, I was humbled by this big challenge he was taking on. And he looked at me, he said, not in a million years would I take the risk and sign up for a year-long leadership program. Like, he's so not interested in knowing himself at that level and having to do that deep dive into birth. And I realized we all have our Mount Everest, right? Our risk is relative, right? To me, climbing Mount Everest is too big of a risk of my life, but I'll step into the fire of getting to know myself and how I could serve other people where he wouldn't go near it.
And that story right there, Jeffrey, is just $1 million story right there in terms of us understanding that, like you say, we all have our own Mount Everest. And it's really important for us to remember that, because when we look at other people who we admire, and maybe we don't even admire them, we look at other people and we see what they're doing or what we think they're doing. And somehow it always seems like it's bigger and more than what we're doing, instead of embracing the thing that we have chosen to take on ourselves, as if somehow, our measure of who we are and our success is to be measured against what someone else is doing. And it always ends up with us being on the downside of that story. And yet every time you tell someone you're doing something, they look at you and they're like, oh my God, really? I could never imagine myself doing that. And like you with your friend, he turns around and looks at you and says, no fucking way am I going to do something like that.
Yeah.
And so we're all made up of these magnificent things that lead us to going, to go down a path that is taking us to the place that we want to go. And everyone else is just looking in. But they all have their own Mount Everest that they're climbing and that they're conquering. They stand atop that mountain because that is what they've been called to do or what their passion is and so forth. And I just think that, it's really interesting that your friend chose to take on this very arduous physical journey and you chose to take on a journey that was deeply personal and intensely emotional. And how would you describe your friend and how would you describe yourself and the fact that he chose to go the route of this, incredibly physically challenging endeavor and you chose the route you did?
Mm-hmm. So, I love him dearly. And like I said, he's my closest male friend and has been for, decades. How I would describe him is, first of all, instantly charming, like in the most generous, giving person you'll meet in your life, but doesn't want to dive too deep, right? I mean, just so, hey, and sometimes I question whether he doesn't have it right or, does anyone who just kind of keeps life on the surface, like, well, let's not look for all the answers, right? And he's how's your day? Great. It's always great, right? So everything's a little bit more on the surface where, I'm the deep diver. Right. And there's no right or wrong. But to your point, I think that what you're making here is such an important point that we almost always overlook what comes easy to us. And so the challenges we face, the risks that we take, we don't necessarily see them as risky where somebody else might. And the same is true even when the entrepreneurs and the business people that I work with, it's the same thing as to why they're challenged with charging what they're worth. Right? Because what comes easy to them, they discount, like, well, I shouldn't have, why should I charge for that? This is what comes so easy.
Yeah.
Instead of charging for your genius, right? Your genius is your gift. Your genius is what comes easy to you. One of the exercises I do in my branding work to try to really kind of get down underneath, someone's inherent value. And that's really what we're talking about here. We're talking about inherent value. Like, what is your inherent value that probably isn't obvious to you? And this is why I often say, like, this is work that you cannot do by yourself because you need the mirroring. One of the exercises I do is I have my clients make a list of compliments that they've heard about themselves, probably throughout their lives. And it's very interesting to just start naming the compliments you've heard. And it's almost always the compliment that people have heard that they've brushed off. Like, well, yeah, what's the big deal about that? Which is actually what the world is calling that they want more from you. And that they actually see the highest value in, right? So I was working with a client once who was really she was a coach and she's really looking to find her space in the coaching world. And the reason for doing this work, Arlene, by the way, is that, every field is so much more competitive than it used to be. So what's your unique perspective? Right. How do you stand out? And she was looking for her unique space in the world of coaching. And she's a friend. We're in that leadership program together and I was helping her finding her unique brand. And I called her one day for some personal advice and I hung up and it occurred to me. So I called her right back and I said, let me ask you something. Do people call you all the time for you to help them see things clearly? Like, they call with a cluttered mind and you help them see it clearly? She was a former IBM executive. She goes, oh God, my whole life. She goes, every board meeting, everybody would look to me to cut to the chase. Right. And I'm like, that's it. The world needs people like you who can cut to the chase. I realize I call you every time I can't see clearly because you have a way of making things clear for me. There's value in that. Oh, right. And here she was like, oh yeah, I've heard that my whole life, blah, blah, blah. Who wants it? I'm like, and that's valuable. It's a role to play. It's a role to play in the world that people want more of. So absolutely, whether it's our risks, whether it's our value, it's really hard for us to see the value in what is so innate to us. It's our second nature.
And it's so interesting, Jeffrey, when you tie this back to people having difficulty charging what they're worth, that I mean, it's really eye-opening to consider that when people are expert at something, it's usually something that comes really easy to them. And
Yes.
they've studied it a lot, and they like it a lot because it's something that just comes natural. They have a natural affinity for or to it. And then you move to this place of, okay, now you're going to start working with people and share this expertise that you have. And what is the disconnect for people when they, have this extraordinary talent or capability or expertise, and they somehow, I don't think it's that they're selling themselves short. Is it that they really are not actually truly valuing all of what it is that they know that they can share with people that can actually solve problems for people? Or what is that about in your experience?
They just don't see it. So I just gave, last month I gave it to my first TEDx talk. And the title of the TEDx talk is Validation Paradox, Finding Our Best Through Others. So if you imagine, so I walk out in the TEDx, and I know you'll appreciate this. I walk out on the TEDx stage, and the first thing I say is, we all have closets to come out of. So the sequence of this talk, this TEDx talk, is I first set the stage as to how we end up in these closets. Well, we end up in closets because of expectations, right? Expectations are put on us. We put tons of expectations on ourselves. But the key thing to know here is that expectation, by definition, is a predetermined outcome. Right? So we live our life with these expectations, which already predetermine in our own minds what we believe we're capable of. Right? So how do we get out of that? And ultimately, the talk goes through this sequence of setting up the situation that we end up in closets because of the expectations that are set upon us by others and by ourselves. And many of us, had expectations put on us, or, like a lot of the people I work with who will say, I felt like the black sheep in my family, right? Because creatives, the innovatives, we tend to felt like the odd ones out. So because of that, we kind of collapsed in our own expectations. So now here we are residing in these closets, if you will. The talk revolves into, the little bit of a touch of the story as to for myself coming out of the closet. And ultimately ends with what I think is the most powerful analogy of what you're asking, which is, to me, was the turning point of the talk when I say, you know what, maybe these closets we think we're hiding in are more like glass shower stalls, fogged up, but far more translucent than we realize. So the point of the validation paradox, and then how I define this validation paradox, is that we believe we're trying to find ourselves, what we're capable of, our best gift to give to the world. We're trying to do this on our own internal journey. But the problem is that we are inherently limited by our own predetermined expectations. The way that we get out of that is that we realize other people can see more in us than we can see in ourselves. And then we have to believe them. Right? We have to realize we can only see as much in ourselves as we have already predetermined. The only way you get past your own expectations and predeterminations is to allow other people to see more in you than you can see in yourself and believe them. And this is actually, and I in my talk, I'll just qualify real quick, Arlene. In my talk, I actually validate this by talking about an African culture. In Africa, there's a term, Ubuntu. Ubuntu really translates to I am I because of we, right? It's more than just we are the culmination of 5 people around us. Ubuntu really believes that who we become is a result of what other people can see in our hearts and our souls. And when we allow ourselves the transparency, the glass shower stalls for people to see in, it is like they extract and pull that out of us. So I believe that the reason we limit ourselves, limit our worth, limit what we're capable of being, limit our risks is because we're only allowing ourselves to see as much as we can see. That's why.
And Jeffrey, this is so fascinating to me because I wonder why it is. It's like with people working with coaches. It's really hard for someone to realize the value of working with a coach. And everything that you just said is spot on about why you work with a coach, because they can see something that you or we cannot. in ourselves. And I think that there's this weird thing that goes on where people will not hesitate. Well, they may hesitate depending on who they are, but people will hesitate to go into therapy, or excuse me, they won't hesitate to go into therapy because they understand what therapy is. They're going to go in and excavate every last fucking thing their parents did to them when they were children and just, let me just, feel like shit for years, and then maybe I'll have an epiphany and I'll come out of this and I'm going to feel like shit for years because now I'm dredging up all of whatever happened to me throughout my life and trauma and everything else. Versus if you worked with a coach where you are today in your adult self, where you could actually be more, shall we say, self-actualized around this whole piece that is you, that is the essence of who we are, our calling, what we were meant to do, that, as you say, with our own predetermined expectations that maybe we even come into the world with, that we can't actually see the value of working with someone who can truly set us free. And I have never understood why in sports people automatically understand that if you're going to get good at something, you need to have a coach who's expert at that sport or in instruction, teaching you how to do what you're going to do so that you can go out and excel at this thing that you want to do. And yet when it comes to people, us, trying to understand who we are and how magnificent we can be, and that it really does take more than just us. What is the deal with that? Why are people so reluctant? I mean, it can't just be about the money.
No, it's first of all, I believe they can work in synchronicity therapy and coaching, because therapy is about digging into what was and how you got. So here's the difference. Therapy is usually about figuring out how you got to where you are. Coaching is about how to get from where you are to where you want to go. Therapy doesn't take you to where you want to go. It just helps you understand how you got here. And that level of consciousness helps you want to go forward. But without the support, you don't actually wind up doing anything with it. So I find, I coach primarily people who have some years behind them. I'm not coaching 20-year-olds. I'm coaching people who have some years behind them. So they've either done the therapy work and are completely ready to embrace just moving forward, or it works in synchronicity. But the key to what you're saying here is, I'll be the first one to admit, the first time I was in a health food store, and the first time I saw a business card tacked on a board that said life coach, I'm like, what the hell is that? Aren't we supposed to know how to live? I remember thinking that's ridiculous, life coach, right? Of course, now I've come to understand it very differently. Somehow there was that initial feeling like, well, I'm inherently supposed to know how to live. Why should I have someone coach me through that? Right. But here I think is the best representation. I don't know if you know the name Marshall Goldsmith, but Marshall is, by every organization out there, considered the number one, person in the field of personal development, like the number one coach. I mean, every accolade you could imagine. And when I interviewed him for my podcast, he had said something to me that was so profound. I had read somewhere in his content that he has a woman call him. Imagine this, Arlene. He has a woman, he's well into his 70s, if I had to guess. I'm not sure of his exact age, but he's an older gentleman. He has had a woman call him every evening for 30 years. And I asked him, I said, okay, Marshall, I said, I kind of know the answer here, but I've got to hear this from you. You have a woman call you every evening, like 7 o'clock in the evening or something. A woman calls him for 30 years and asks him a series of, I think, 7 questions, which he has given her. He's given her these 7 questions, such as, have I done my best today? Have I taken a step in a forward direction? Every day for 30 years, he's being called, right? So,
wow.
And when I asked him, he said, Jeffrey, I am considered the number one guru of personal development in the world. And I have a woman call me every evening to ask me these questions. If I know that I can't go it alone, why would anybody think they can go it alone?
Wow.
Right? I mean, that just says it all, right? I mean, this is an older gentleman. So I think it's just, I said, I think we think we're supposed to know this stuff, and maybe we do, But if you want to get to the next level, there's just what I find as a coach. And I think 90% of my role as a coach is to help people see what they can't see, point out their blind spots. I've really stepped into it even more. And I know this as a branding expert, right? I mean, this is what branding is to me. When I look at, as a coach of branding and lingo, and this is what I'm focused on is I can see the brandability in somebody that they can't see. I can see their core message that they can't see. I can see how that's marketable that they can't see. And it excites me beyond belief. So I just think we have to work with somebody else, because we again, if we don't get support, we are limited by what we've already predetermined of ourselves. And what we've predetermined of ourselves is really limited compared to what we're capable of.
Right. It's almost like, the capacity of the brain, and we're accessing 10% of the brain right now. But for people who are tapping into more of the brain, I mean, the possibilities are limitless, because tapped into something else. And it's the same thing here, that if someone can enable us to see something that we can't see, then look at how many doors open for us. And you, in your business of branding and helping people, understand how they need to be presenting themselves out in the world. I think oftentimes when people think about branding, they're thinking about logos and websites and shit like this, as opposed to, okay, what is the messaging? What is the package that you're putting out there? Who is it that you are, that you're wanting to present to the world? That is branding, because that's how people are going to come to know you. And one thing I wanted to ask you about this is do you think that the whole idea of people finally deciding to reach out and work with something has anything to do with them achieving a certain level of success in their life, and then they're having a hard time moving forward? Or do you think that a person could be, Jane Q. Public working at 7-Eleven, who decides that she needs to get somebody to help her do this thing that she wants to do, or help her move forward? Do you think there are any variables out there that make it more likely that a person is inclined to reach out to somebody to help them, or is it just completely random?
Gosh, that's such a good question, and a challenging one to answer, because I guess I just don't know. I guess in my heart, and I somewhat believe we're all on different evolutionary paths at different degrees, right? When I look at how all those folks that I have heard say to me that they felt like the black sheep, the misfit in their family, and I was one of them. And when you have felt like one of those, like I was such a black sheep in my family, I just really was so different than everybody around me. Most often we walk away feeling like we're less than, right? That's the inherent feeling, which kind of causes us to collapse within ourselves. We feel less than. What I believe is that actually people that feel like the misfits, the black sheeps, are actually more than. Because I think they are inherently born into the world at a higher level of consciousness. In order for humans,
I agree.
Right? In order for humans to move forward and to develop, we constantly need people that are born into the world of higher consciousness. And, I felt like less than most of my life, until I realized that I almost was more, I had more awareness. I had more, which is why I get so frustrated when I see the world try to tell creative thinking people to focus on one thing, to sit still, to stop bouncing around, right? Because they're shutting down that natural ability that higher consciousness people have to see more, hear more, and feel more, right? The reason creatives chase squirrels and shiny objects is because we see more, hear more, feel more. Why shut more down, right? Does it need to be channeled so it's productive? Yes, but that's a learned skill. But we don't want to shut down higher consciousness, which is what happens. So I think, as to whether one person steps up and gets help or not, I think it's whether they determine whether they're on a journey of higher consciousness and advancement. And I talk a lot about humbleness, because I think humbleness is one of our biggest obstacles, internal obstacles. Humbleness is and I always seem to get some negative feedback after I say this, but I'm going to go for it anyway. Because, hey, humbleness is a good quality and it's deeply embedded in a lot of religious cultures, right? To not be egotistical, to be humble. I mean, I was raised in a family where my mother would come in and yell at me for looking in the mirror too long when I was blow drying my hair in the 70s.
Getting ready to go out.
And I still do. It's just I had more hair and it was bigger hair in the 70s, so it took longer. But, literally I was told, don't look in the mirror too long, you'll become conceited. Right? Like as if mirrors had powers.
That was so common in the 70s.
Yes.
People were saying, oh, you're so conceited.
Conceited, but like mirrors had powers. So there is culturally and religious cultures have this embedded idea that we must remain humble. And hey, you know what? It's a good life value, but humbleness is also a lie to ourselves. It causes us to shut down our power. And if you talk to, I remember watching Oprah on an interview, and I've spoken through my podcast to so many people that have accomplished amazing things. And I'll say it too. If you really get someone to the point of being comfortable and you ask them, they will tell you, and I've heard Oprah say it, I knew I was special from a very early age. Mm-hmm. It is hard to openly say that to people. And I gained more respect for Oprah in that moment when I heard her say this on a talk show than I ever had, because that is brave to say to yourself, because here's somebody who was sexually abused, physically abused, rough family situation, and knew she was special. And I would say the same thing of myself. From a very early age, I didn't know what it was, and I knew I felt like the black sheep, but I had an inkling in my gut that said, I don't know what it is, but somehow in this life, I'm going to stand out. Mm-hmm. There's something about me that's different than everybody else. And I think a lot of us have that in our gut, and we're too afraid to admit it. And I always say that what closes the gap for most people from where they are to where they want to go is their willingness to admit to themselves that they're special, that they've got something.
Mm-hmm. That is so magnificent, because I really think that there is something special in every single person. And it's this thing that you're talking about of being able to and willing to embrace it. And because we have all grown up in a culture that does not encourage people to embrace their specialness. Oh yeah, we're happy to embrace the specialness when those people become rich and famous, and now they're the objects of our desire. But for them to actually say anything about themselves, it's one thing to be, a kid that can, he's playing t-ball and he knocks the ball out of the park, as a kid, or he can kick the football, 100 yards when he's 4 years old. All these things where there is this physical thing that people are doing, and everybody's like, oh yeah, look how special he is. He's so talented, la 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 la, because you can see with your own eyes that, yes, this kid is really talented. But then for the kid who's 4 years old, as I'm sure it was probably the case when you realized that yourself, and probably Oprah and myself, because I felt that same way as well, that you are not permitted to even make mention of that, because how dare you? Who are you to think that you can do this? And this is not unlike what happens when people are driving down the street and somebody is, going to inch their way in between the cars or in front of them, or somebody cuts in front of you going really fast. And we have this indignance about us. It's like, how dare you? Who do you think you are? And it's like, excuse me? Where did we ever learn that? You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's the
absolutely.
weirdest thing.
Yeah, I said it's cultural. It's like I said, it's as a culture, we're still this deep religious roots to a lot of our culture, and humbleness. Well, I said, hey, it's a good value. This is the distinction, right? Humbleness is a good value, but here's what, and I'll bet you have felt the same too, and I can see it. First of all, people like Oprah, people, if you come into what you do, into your greatness from a purposeful, soulful place, that will only get accentuated, right? Most people, if you're a jerk coming in, you're a jerk going out, right? But if you're purpose-driven and soul-driven and heart-centered coming in, for the most part, that's going to be accentuated by you stepping into your greatness. It doesn't, but we somehow feel like that's going to fall apart. I've had coaching clients, when I'm trying to encourage them to stand out a little bit more and I'm trying to make their branding bolder, they'll say, well, I don't want to be that kind of person. Like, who's that person? Right? What is that? Right.
It's like people, it's like people saying, when they need to have an email list and they need to let people know that they're out there, and they say, oh, well, I don't want to bother people. It's like, well, if you don't bother them, nobody's going to know you're there. What the fuck are you doing?
Yeah. Yep. Exactly. So it's, we are outnumbered in our world, I believe, by brilliant and bold people holding themselves back far more than there are people in the world that are too much to handle. I think we have a world full of people who are living below their level of boldness and capability.
Yeah.
I just don't worry about the egotists of the world, because honestly, they're few and far between. The epidemic plaguing our world are people who are holding themselves back from all that they're capable of being, because we need them to show up.
Yeah,
we need
absolutely.
The bold ones to show up. We need the world changers to show up. I see the difference even in the millennial generation, which cracks me up. I've got 3 millennials, and I watch 50-year-olds like myself. Oh, those millennials, they're entitled. I'm like, are you kidding me? They're the first generation to have the balls to not settle. Our parents stayed, right? Our parents stayed in marriages they were miserable in. They stayed in jobs that they hated. Our generation, it wasn't until midlife that we actually woke up that we don't have to compromise everything in our lives, which is why divorce rate, midlife crisis became such a thing for our generation. Good for the next generation to actually get it right. If there isn't a job they don't like, they'd create one. They look at relationships as starter marriages, and good for them, right? I mean, they're just so much more realistic, and they don't set the boundaries between countries. They'll just like, I want to go here, I want to go there. What frustrates them is that the world creates these boundaries that they don't inherently see. Mm-hmm. Right? So good for them, though. The first generation, I said, to have the audacity to not settle.
Right. Absolutely. And I want to see what you think about this. When you think about this generation as opposed to our generation, decades older than the one that's out there now. And this whole idea of not being bold, do you think that there is anything about the idea of you're not going to be bold, because if you are, you're going to be punished for it. You will lose the loss of the perceived love that you have in your life. Therefore, you have to quiet it down, versus the generation of today. And perhaps their sense of a greater sense of security and the extent that they are being loved by their parents. And certainly there are plenty of children who are not. There's no shortage of that. But I'm just curious about where our relationship to the people in our lives, and love in particular, fit into all of that for our generation as opposed to the one today. And maybe not at all, but I do think it is a rather compelling thing, because what could motivate you more than the potential loss of love, and that silence you? I mean, what could be a greater motivator to keep you quiet?
It's a really interesting point. I think the generation after us is living in one of the biggest dualities we've seen, because I think they do there's a stability about them to create the world that they want. And yet I think as generations go, they grew up in one of the most unstable times ever. And I've talked to my kids about this, and it was really my son who pointed out to me the instability in which his world has existed from a very early age. I lived just outside of New York City during 9/11. So we're talking 17 years ago. He was 8 years old. My sons, my kids were like 8, 3, and 1. And everything did change after that, especially when you were in the proximity. I mean, we lost 3 family friends. World changed. The whole world changed after 9/11. Their definition. I mean, I had to go pull my kids. The schools were on lockdown because we were close enough to the city. But then when it was possible, we had to go retrieve our kids. We lived in an area that wasn't far from a nuclear plant. So that residents it was made available to us. And yes, I ran right to get them. But it was pills were made available to us as residents within a certain radius of this nuclear plant that we could take a pill. Should there be an attack on the nuclear plant, we were to take this pill, which would hopefully block some of the radiation from entering our livers, right? So we had a plan, and our plan was to meet in Woodstock, Vermont, right? So because I worked about an hour from home, so my then wife, who was off with the kids and the kids were in school, we also had friends. We had concocted a plan that should we be separated and there be a catastrophe, that we need to let's meet in Woodstock, Vermont. Right, we had a location. So these were conversations we had with our kids. They grew up in this world, and of course, there's the economic crisis. They actually have grown up as an incredibly unstable world. They no longer believe that the job they have is going to last forever. The relationship they're in is going to be the one and only.
Right.
So there's an instability, but they also are, the millennial generations embrace the YOLO attitude, which is sort of their anthem. Somehow, all of this has led them to have the healthiest relationship with mortality I've ever seen from any other generation. My mother is 80 years old, just did her will like 2 weeks ago, doesn't want to look at death, right? And yet 20-year-olds, millennials, are looking at their own mortality and saying, hey, I get it. Life isn't forever. So while I'm here, I'm going to make a difference. Right. So as is often the case, I'm a huge believer in dichotomy and paradox. As is often the case, this generation which has grown up with incredible instability, has a lot more stability in their attitude at the way they're approaching life. And I think, and I know I actually was reading a study recently how the baby boomer generation, I'm the last year of the baby boomer generation, that baby boomers and millennials have one of the more unique relationships that's ever been done, ever seen in history. And I would say it's true that there's a symbiotic relationship between millennials and baby boomers, that it's not this hierarchical relationship as much as it had been in previous generations. There's a little bit more of a peer relationship, right, between millennials.
Yeah.
And so we're learning from each other. And I kudos to baby boomers as well, and all the generations around that who are open to learning from the children that are following us. And I think we have a lot to learn.
Well, and I think it's really interesting that the baby boomers are entering a period of life where, they've put the decades into their careers and now are at a turning point where either they are being, shall we say, aged out of the workforce, or they have finished a career and have decided to start something else. And they still want to be productive because why not? Just because you're in your 50s does not mean you're not productive. It actually means you're probably going to have the most productive years of your life, but they will not be within, and I use this word deliberately, the confines of the workplace that I came into employment in, where you work for somebody else. And, I was never going to work for somebody for 30 years. Fuck that. No way. Too boring. But most people were going to go work for a corporation, and that's just how you did it. But many of the baby boomers now are looking at the next stage of life where they're saying, yes, there's tremendous uncertainty now. I don't know what's going to happen. I don't know if my nest egg is going to carry me all the way through. And I still want to do something interesting. And they're starting new businesses in the same way that the millennials are. So I absolutely think that there is a symbiotic relationship, and they're learning from one another, because I completely agree with you, Jeffrey, that they are functioning much more like peers, because they are of an age where there's enough of an age gap there that the baby boomers aren't likely to be the parents of those millennials. The age range just didn't work. So I think it's really fascinating. And one question to you about this is, do you think this is associated with the level of uncertainty and instability that exists, that there actually comes out of that this energy and this momentum that propels the baby boomers and the millennials forward, which enables them to see things the way they do and really get moving and make shit happen?
Yeah, I do. Like I said, I think they have an unusual relationship with mortality, right? There's a way in which, because you could look at mortality and it could cause you to dread and to shut down, right? Or it can cause you to see mortality as a finite time. So while I'm here, I'm going to make a difference. And I think that's how the millennial generation, for the most part, has taken it. And I think that's what we're learning from them. I was walking past a bookstore in New York City one day, and in the window was a book. The title of the book was something like, how to do better than your parents or something like that. So I took a picture of it. I took a picture. You can imagine me, right? So I took a picture of this to the window and I sent it to all my kids. I texted to all my kids and said, I'm not going down without a fight. Right. So, it's there because there's just an innate competition, but I think that's what I've learned. I've learned to embrace from the millennial generation. I've learned to embrace like, hey, let's, we're here. And to your point, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I have coaching clients in their late 60s and 70s that I work with who I'm helping them brand their new businesses and they're 70 years old. Right.
Yeah.
I mean, I love that. One of my other coaching clients has a blog called I'm Not Dead Yet. He's a 55-year-old man who very successful and left a company he founded, not knowing what his next move was. I mean, he reached out to me as a coach because like, all right, I've left a company I founded and I don't want to do the same old thing. I'm 55 years old. I have 2 years to figure out what my next move is. Like, okay, we can do this. And we did. We've carved out an amazing, unheard of direction for him. I mean, literally what he's doing in the world didn't exist. We had to make it up. I think it's kind of like Airbnb for C-suite executives. Put your head around that. Like, it's just awesome. It's literally temporary contracts for as a C-suite executive to fill in the gaps that companies come into. And I mean, it's brilliant. Literally, the title doesn't exist out there. But we knew there was a marketplace for it. He could be a CFO, CEO, CMO, COO. He knows all those roles. So he can, but he doesn't want to work nonstop. So contract-based works great. There are companies that have gaps in their C-suite and he steps in and fills it in.
Damn,
right?
That is incredible.
Didn't even exist. We made it up because I was like, here's something. Here's an idea. And we ran with it and tested it and he immediately got a good response and it's just beginning for him. And here he's 55 years old, knew what he wanted out of how he wanted to live. And, we can make it up. We can create our lane. And that's what we've done for him.
Oh, I love that. Create your lane. That's really, really fucking brilliant. And, I'm sitting here thinking, okay, I just want to talk to you all day. I just never want to hang up with you. But with the time that we have left, Jeffrey, I mean, there's 1,000 things. I've been making notes throughout the whole time you've been talking, and I would love to have you come back for another episode because I have several questions that came out of everything that you've been talking about. But I wanted to ask you one thing about your life as a photographer and how much of an influence that has had on you in terms of you coming to a place where you wrote this book called Lingo.
Oh, beautiful. Well, everything, honestly. I mean, the book Lingo is based on how I changed my photography career from a failing one to a super successful one in the course of a year. I mean, actually, I made the changes of the course for about 3 months. And a year later, I multiplied my business times 5. Right. So, that's the book and the story is told right up front. Not quite in the introduction. That's a different story, but the stage is set by how I learned the secret language, the lingo of the people I was going to serve, which were the most affluent in the country. And yet I didn't come from that. I came from a lower middle class upbringing. So how do you then become the go-to photographer nationwide for some of the most affluent families in the United States? Well, you understand them. Right? You understand their lingo, their essence. You understand what the world looks like from their perspective, which I had to learn. Right? So I had to learn that. So the entire premise of the book is actually, how I built my business. I think it's more important now than ever because of some of the things we were talking about. I was asked once on a business podcast, the craziest question. The host said to me, "What do you think the future of human evolution is?" Now, this is a business podcast. And I'm like, why the hell am I being asked this? But what really surprised me is how quickly I had an answer. It's like sometimes you shock yourself. It's like, damn, I do have people have always told me I have an answer for everything. They're right. So I had an answer. I was like, well, I think we're heading towards nonverbal communication. Right. And what I meant by that is not that we're not going to talk, but as a society and as a species, we make decisions based on how we feel about people and businesses much more than ever. Again, I've been in business for over 3 decades. I can tell you, we used to make decisions from our mind. Now we make decisions from our gut. How do we feel about somebody? Because somebody can be the best in their field and we will choose to not do business with them because we don't feel good about them. We're not aligned with their values. We don't like who they are or how they present themselves in the world. And we will choose to not do business with them. And on the other hand, what we want to do through amazing branding which is what Lingo is all about. It's about creating the branding strategies that your ideal customer feels like you are in their head talking to them and you get them at a visceral level. When people respond to you that way, like, oh my gosh, this person gets me, they will pay anything to work with you. They feel like, wow, this person gets me. So that's, this is how I was able to close the gap from where I started in life, lower middle class, and how in a very short period of time, inside of a year, I was able to work with such wealthy people is because I did the self-study of myself and aligned that with the values and behaviors of the people I was going to serve and created a business for them. Right? That's the key. And this is the key to branding. 90% of businesses are built backwards. People go into business, they start a website, they throw a bunch of words in the website, but they haven't done the preliminary work to understand all the gifts that we were talking about before that lie in them that has not been brought out yet. And then they haven't done that work. And then they haven't done the work of understanding who would love that. That's the name of the second chapter of my book, which is about defining your ideal customer. It's called Who Will Love That, right? So first you understand yourself. Then you say, well, who would love that? There's your ideal customer. Then you craft the branding, the messaging that aligns who you are with who they are in a secret language such that they respond to it by saying, wow, this person, this business gets me and I want to do business with them. The result is that you end up having a business, which is my goal, where you only work with your ideal customers. You're not wasting your time working with people who aren't willing to pay you what you're worth. Right? So the book it's really embedded in my original story, and yet I think it's more. That's what's interesting about it, Arlene, is that it's this 30-year-old story in a way, and how I changed my business and my life, and yet it's more relevant today than ever.
Yeah, amazing how that works. And you know what, I want to ask you something about what is it about you that enabled you to understand these things about your prospective clients, where you had to understand who they were to be able to be in their world where you were selling to them and you were providing services to them? Because there is something that you understand. There's something about you that is different from your friend who went and climbed Mount Everest, where he's looking at you going into this, deep dive, this deep emotional dive into yourself that was part of your personal development, and he doesn't want any part of this. And there's something markedly different between the two of you that allowed you to go and have the kind of career that you did, that was very much about reading people and understanding what made them tick. And that ultimately led you to enough insight to be able to write this book. And what do you think that difference is? So
I almost see it as a rolling ball. All right. So I'll try to lay this out in a sequence, because I've, as you could imagine, I thought about this. So until my mid-20s, I suffered from tremendous shyness, like paralyzing shyness. I didn't go out into the world. I didn't have friends. I really sheltered myself and avoided contact with the world. And I know it may be hard to see now, but that's reality. And I went off to photography school paralyzed with fear, but I wanted to, that's why I didn't go to college. I went to a small trade school. So until till 23, 24 years old, I really was paralyzed by shyness. So what shyness enabled me to do, particularly from a really young age, like a 6-year-old, 8-year-old, and I can have memories of this, I am a masterful observer. Right. So when you don't participate in life, your choice then is to observe it. So as a young child, I observed what made people tick. The bullies, the successful people, my family, myself. Like, I observed everything like a sponge. So, then I choose I want to do bigger things in life. So I kind of grow myself out of that and apply, my skill set into the world in a practical way as a photographer, which puts me in exchange with a lot of people and people that are, really, I have a lot to learn from. The result of that, as this ball tends to roll, now I look back and say, all of that information has enabled, has actually honed an intuition. And you write out my bio, and that's why it's in my bio, that I feel 33 years as a photographer and observing people through my lens. I've been, and then all those years of shyness, I've been studying human behavior and emotional triggers my whole life. So what that enables me to do is I can feel people's internal message and how that translates into branding it's just an innate skill in me. I mean, my coaching clients respond to it. I've been in masterminds where people are like, one of my coaching clients, my favorite testimonial ever, we were part of a mastermind, and she sent me a note that I now use as a testimonial that said, you remind me of Glinda the Good Witch. And this, as a gay man, there's so many things I love about this. But she said, you remind me of Glinda the Good Witch for your ability to see what's in people that's already there. Mm-hmm. And I would agree. When you've been looking at people through a camera lens for 3 decades, when you've been shy your whole life looking at people, I truly can see in people what they can't see in themselves. And I can feel it in my body. I can see people's gifts. I can see what they're meant to put out into the world. And I can see how that can be changed into a strong branding message. And then I help them do that. So it's like a rolling ball. Like my shyness has probably been my best education. And then 30 years behind a camera lens, when you're looking at life through a piece of glass and you observe everything, it's, and being a photographer was far more than just what I saw with my eyes, because in order to capture good photographs of people, you have to sense their being. So it's extremely intuitive. And one of the things that's always, validates that, I guess you could say, as a photographer, is to know when we release the shutter. We're releasing the shutter of a camera at a fraction of a second. It might be 1/250th of a second. Your brain can't process when it's time to push that shutter, but your gut does. Right? So that's right. So that's the intuition that I feel 30 years as a photographer has really developed in me. My ability to look at someone, an entrepreneur, is what I try to focus on, and see what they're not seeing and help translate that into strong branding so that the world gets to receive what they're good at.
Mm-hmm. Oh my God, that is so magnificent. Jeffrey, I have, in what you just said, I have so many things that I want to ask you, because, I mean, I will have to ask, I'm having a hard time right now even constructing any words, because what happens to me oftentimes is I'll have about 5 things I want to say at the same time, and I can't get any of them out of my mouth because, my brain is firing like crazy right now with everything that you've said. Because, one of the things that struck me is for a young person that is coming through life who is so painfully shy, to go into a world behind the camera, someone could argue that you're hiding behind the camera.
Absolutely.
But in fact, yes, of course you can hide there, but I think that explanation is way too simplistic, because in fact, you're continuing the observation of the world, not from a place of hiding, but a place of really being interested in what is going on out there, and having the intuition and the knowledge and experience to understand the moment where everything is revealed. Yep. And no one in their brain can actually accomplish that. It is only through someone who is the consummate observer, and you became that as a result of a deeply painful experience of being so shy. And certainly you weren't rewarded for being shy, I would imagine. And you come into this place in life where you are, you're not out photographing landscapes, you're photographing families. And I would imagine the dynamics that you saw even before you snapped, your camera, you were seeing all kinds of things in the dynamics between those family members, because you understood enough from just observing throughout your entire life of what's actually going on that either no one is talking about or no one is letting on, which explains how it is that, everyone says to you, you see things that no one else does.
Correct.
What a magnificent story, Jeffrey. This is, you should see my piece of paper here. It just looks like this big flow chart with all kinds of arrows and circles and emphasis here and there. And I feel like I've been sitting in a master class on all things, related to what it means to be a magnificent human being, which it's very clear that you are, Jeffrey.
Oh, gosh, thank you. That's a big statement.
So delightful. Well, one thing that people know about me is I never lie. I don't make shit up and I don't bullshit people. And I call it the way I see it. And so before we wrap up, normally and we'll have another conversation. I'd love to have you back because I'd love to talk with you more just about a lot of your personal experiences, which are many and just, eye-opening to say the least. And I think it would be interesting for my audience to hear that part of your story. And typically out of those stories that people share with me about the huge challenges that they've overcome in their life that set them on a completely different trajectory that brought them to where they are in their life today. Maybe with the people you've worked with as your clients or with people in general, and just with the benefit of your wisdom and observation in life, that when people are really struggling and trying to figure out what their next move is, do you have any thoughts or insights that you would share with them that might help them to keep their perspective or have an understanding of where they are in their life right now and how they can make that next move?
I'd say be kind to yourself, right? I mean, I would start with that because, consider what you have accomplished. Consider your wins. Consider what got you to where you are. Because it's easy when making our next move to, because it very well may be that we're making our next move, like I was saying early on that, I'm standing right at this point in my life in this empty room with having cleared my plate of so many things in my life and in my career that I don't think are of my highest purpose. So I've cleared them all away and now I'm standing in an empty room considering, what's my next move? And believe me, sometimes there are some mornings I'm like, are you the biggest idiot? Like you just you destroyed a really successful photography career to make room for what your next move is. But do you know what it is? Do you know what's coming? And, here I just wrote a book, launched January 30th, just did a TEDx talk. The video's not even out for it. The stage is set for a lot of things to make this move more clear. But right now, it's not entirely clear what this next move will be. And there are many mornings, there are moments where I'll think, I'm the biggest idiot in the world, but who would give up a successful photography career like I did? But when I'm gentle and kind with myself, I remind myself of what I have accomplished. And I remind myself of certain podcast hosts, J.V. Crum III from Conscious Millionaire. Mm-hmm. I was on his show recently to talk about lingo, and I had been on his show years ago. And when we finished the interview, he said, "You are not the same man." He said, "You are so clear and on purpose and on mission and strong with what you're doing." He said, "You're just not even the same man." Right? So
wow.
That reminds me, that's when I'm kind to myself. That's when I remind myself and say, yes, I may be standing in an empty room, not entirely sure what my next move is. But what I can say is that I've grown. What I can say is that I'm clear on what my gifts are, what my skill set can offer to people. And I may not be clear on what the next move looks like or where I'm going to end up, but I can acknowledge what got me here and feel really good about that. So that's why I say, sometimes when we're in that next move place to count your wins, to count what got you here, be gentle with yourself, even through the fires that we've all gone through. And I agree with you. It'd be interesting to do a follow-up because you know what? This may all, to your listeners, this may all sound perfect. I've accomplished so much. It's been very upbeat. It's been inspiring. Well, our next conversation can be about the shit. Right? I don't mind exposing it. I mean, I've had some serious, I didn't get here by, with rose-colored glasses. I mean, I've had bizarre circumstances and things happen in my life, just as we all have. Right? So what you see today is not a culmination of perfect moments. It's the culmination of determination through the tough times.
Oh, absolutely. And it's actually the culmination of a lot of next moves. And I think that the really freeing thing about looking at life as a series of what's your next move questions, you can understand that everything is about we keep moving and there's momentum and there's always a next move because you're always being faced with yet another decision that you have to make in life. You don't just land somewhere and you stop. You keep moving, and it's a glorious journey that we're all on, even as hard as it can be and has been as we've gone through life. But really, if you're just operating in life where you're asking yourself all the time, okay, what's my next move? You create a really magnificent life for yourself. And obviously that is what has happened for you. And I know a few of the stories that you've shared with me that, I mean, I'm going to be killing myself laughing when we go through this, because it's like, really?
Yeah, I think it'd be, like I said, I think it'd be a great follow-up because, yeah, it all looks really pretty on paper right now. Next call, we'll find out the truth. And that's okay with me.
I just have to do this one, Jeffrey, because as we're coming to the end of this, I'm going to leave them with this, which is absolutely going to make them tune in. And it's, if you want to talk about challenges in life, let's just talk about the one where your dad died at your wedding. It's
there you go. What? Let's start with that one. At 20 years old, marrying a woman who I didn't know if I really wanted to marry, but I thought would get his approval. And, and it was a woman, but it took me till the age of 44 to figure out I was gay. So yeah, there's a little bit to talk about.
Oh my God, that's going to be a magnificent follow-up episode. And I have no doubt that this episode is going to be one of the ones that people comment the most on. In fact, both of them, the 2-part or 20-part series that we do together, Jeffrey.
Stay tuned to the truth.
Yeah, no kidding. Yeah. Here it comes. Here was the first truth, and now you're going to get the real truth.
Exactly. Yeah.
So as we wrap this up, can you let our listeners know where people can find you? Of course, your book can be found on Amazon. It's called, once again, Lingo, Discover Your Ideal Customer's Secret Language and Make Your Business Irresistible. And a lot of that has to do with the branding of who you actually are. And they can find that at Amazon. And where else can they find you if they're interested in coaching or anything else they might like to know about you?
Sure. Well, JeffreyShaw.com, and it's JeffreyShaw.com. That's it. That's my personal branded site. That's where, speaking, coaching, some stories, everything is there, including links to social media, and which I'm quite active on. So, yeah.
Yeah, I was just going to ask you if all your links were there on JeffreyShaw.com, and they are. So
I don't make it hard to find me.
You're all over the internet too, so it's easy to find you.
Yeah.
Well, what a magnificent time, Jeffrey. I look forward to our next call. We'll go ahead and get that set up offline. And thank you again so very much. This has been a really, really delightful conversation.
Likewise. Thank you so much for having me.
Beautiful. Well, as always, I wrap every show with the same question. What's your next move? I'm Arlene Battisil. I'll be back with another episode. Welcome to What's Your Next Move, the podcast for peak performers who are making things happen but are running into roadblocks that prevent them from getting what they want. Whether you work for someone else, you're an entrepreneur, thinking about starting your own business, or at a point in your life where you just can't make the move from where you are to where you want to go, you're in the right place. This podcast is all about answering one question: what's your next move? And helping you harness your power so your next move is the one that changes your life. I'm your host and resident provocateur, Arlene Battisil, and I want to know, what's your next move?